This meeting is being recorded. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I think I've met most of you, but those of you who I haven't, this is Janine Carpenter from the Women's Fund. I'm the Director of Research and Policy here, and I really love what I do. This is our legislative wrap-up meeting. So the legislative session is over, and now it's sort of, this is some of what happened, this is what's next, this is where our brains are, and please tell me about what you're thinking about, is what we're working on in this meeting. So I'm going to move kind of quickly through what I have prepared so that we can talk together about some other things. So I'm just going to give you a review to start with our priority list and what happened with it. And then we'll talk about some not so great things that happened in our legislature, some issues we'll be continuing to work on, and some new issues that we've started working on, as well as what do you want us to work on conversation. Just so you know, when I'm screen sharing, I can't always, I don't always see the chat or questions or reactions. So feel free. And in fact, I encourage you to interrupt me if you have questions. That is easier than going backwards to talk about things. So this session, we had 10 of the bills on our priority list pass. I think most of you are familiar with our priority list, but if you're not, we create a priority list of legislation that we are lobbying and advocating for. It includes bills that our partners have introduced, bills that work on issues that we've worked on before in the past, bills that address 49-to-1 priority issues, and bills that we have written ourselves in-house. This session, we wrote a bill in-house that would remove the risk of liability from donors and distributors of free menstrual hygiene products in Tennessee. We're the first state in the country to do it, though it has been introduced at the federal level, but hasn't passed yet. And basically, we found out from specifically tampon manufacturers, and then later in our work from some nonprofits, that they did not distribute menstrual hygiene products for fear of liability. And we were like, well, that's silly. Let's remove liability so people have access. And that bill passed. We were really excited about it because honestly, we wrote it about a month before session started and found sponsors and got it to move. So that was a big win for us. 4 of our partners' priority bills on our list passed. The resolution recognizing doulas as essential health workers, which was led by Healthy and Free Tennessee, lifetime orders of protection for victims of certain felonies. That bill passed, and it was led by Tennessee Voices for Victims. The YWCA led a bill that many of you helped us lobby for the last 2 years to start domestic violence training for cosmetologists and barbers. And then TQEE and A Better Balance were both leading advocacy on the creation of a child care sustainability task force, and that bill passed. I know we have other bills by our partners that passed, and we also have some bills from our partners that we will be continuing to work on in the second year of this session. But those 4 passed, and they're all really positive measures for our state. Are there any questions about those first 4 bills since I sort of zipped through them? No? Great. And Katie did post in the chat the full list to all of those with their bill numbers if you want to read more. Like I said, I don't want to spend too much time on the things that most of us are aware of having already happened.
Hey, Janine, I had a quick question about the last one. Was there any parameters set up about when the Child Care Sustainability Task Force would begin, or like what session that is going to be created for?
So it is starting, I believe, July 1, but it might be June 15th. but I think it has to be created by July 1, and it is funded for 2 years is the duration of
Okay,
the task force. So we should have preliminary information from the task force by next summer.
awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. Man, I'm glad I knew that answer. Sometimes I don't when it comes to timelines. Um, 2 bills that we worked on advocating for maintaining past gains. The first had to do with human trafficking, which is an issue that the Women's Fund has historically been very engaged in. And this bill increased in service training about human trafficking for teachers from once ever to something that they have to renew every 3 years. Um, which it's wild, but students are trafficked during school hours. And so we really need teachers and people in schools to be aware of this. This bill only addresses the training for teachers, and our hope is that next session we'll have a bill that addresses this training for all school employees. And the other bill works that passed is the Jim Coley Rape Survivors Protection Act. This bill has a number of elements, but the reason it was on our radar initially was because it deals with speeding up the rape kit processing procedures, but also the communication with the victims and the survivors about where their criminal evidence kit is in processing so that they are included in this process and they understand what's happening. So it improves communication and processing times for rape kits, which is an issue that we see in the news redundantly over and over again. Um, and so these were 2 bills we really prioritized in maintaining past gains. There are a number of maintaining past gains bills that were on our priority list that we will have to continue to watch next year. And I keep saying next year because for those of you who don't know, the Tennessee General Assembly, each session is 2 years long. So this year was the first year of the 112th Assembly. Next year is the second year. So any bills that started or did not start moving this session and have not yet failed could theoretically come back next session. They don't always, but many of them will. And then there were 3 additional bills that we call our 49 to 1 bills because they directly address the measures that contribute to Tennessee being ranked 49th in the status of women. And 3 of these bills passed this year. The first is a bill that was really under the radar for a lot of people, and it increases the wages of direct care professionals contracted by the Tennessee Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. So those direct care professionals are typically um, underpaid. They're also predominantly women and majority women of color. And this bill increases their hourly wage to $15 an hour, which is great because it's a much more sustainable and livable wage, but it more importantly ties an increase and a raise in their wages to the same rate of increase of other state employees. So these are professionals contracted by the state, but not technically employees of the state, will now get the same raises as other state employees moving forward.
I
This
have
is
just got to, oh, I'm sorry, Janine. I've just got to comment on that. When I read that this needed to pass, I was so shocked
Mhm.
that we even had to address this issue of equal pay for really difficult and important work. And I'm just hallelujah to this. This is a great victory.
This it really is. And Katie, it is shocking, but this is really only the first bill of its kind. And um, it's kind of the first crack in the door where the conversation about livable wages and equal pay um, for professions dominated by women of color has really entered into our into our legislature in a way where they were conducive to having the conversation. Um, And this is important because it's the first time that we had folks in really powerful positions in our legislature and really across our legislature saying, oh, this isn't a livable wage that these really important workers are being paid. And acknowledging when something is not a livable wage in this specific circumstance opens the door to really reflect on what we expect of Tennesseans for in any industry or in, working any job if we know they are being paid what is not a livable wage. And I'm hopeful that this will be the beginning of other conversations. But yeah, a wildly important bill. A lot of people didn't understand why I was kind of nutty about it, but I love it. It was sponsored by 2 Chattanooga legislators. I also love that because we have some allies for conversation in the future. The other is a bill, or the next one is a bill that mandates coverage of behavior and mental health services provided via telehealth as it relates to TennCare. Tennessee women report the worst mental health in the country. And, the pandemic in the past year demonstrated how desperately we need access to telehealth opportunities. And there was really nothing in our code to acknowledge telehealth as an approved means of care for mental health services. And this bill includes it. There is no end date to it. This is just a change in code and an acknowledgement that telehealth services are an accepted form for behavioral and mental health counseling. And finally, a pilot program to support Tennessee Promise Scholarship students who experience emergency financial hardships or needs. This is really important because the Tennessee Promise and the Tennessee Hope are scholarships that give opportunity for secondary education to students who oftentimes would not otherwise have access. But those students can also fall into emergency financial hardship or need. And this pilot program, which is established for 4 years, after which it will be evaluated, just sets aside a sum of money to assist students if they have an emergency need, so that if they are in good standing with their scholarships and their academics and they suddenly experience a hardship, it doesn't equate to automatically not being able to continue in their education. We have been longtime supporters of access to education, and this is one of the ways that Tennessee can lift up and support what is already a good program that we have here in the state.
I have a quick question about that.
Yeah.
How will students know that that's available if they do fall into that situation?
So they're in the process of distributing information. Well, they will soon be in the process. I'm sure they're not yet. It hasn't been long enough, but the plan is to distribute the information out through the scholarship office. So Tennessee Promise recipients are in constant communication. And there's a portal that they have to report back into for their community service hours. So there'll be a message through the portal that all students will have access to. And it will also be in the scholarship and financial aid offices of all eligible Tennessee institutions where there are Tennessee Promise recipients. That was a good question. So those are the places from our priority list where we saw some wins. And, 10 wins is the most we've ever had. And we're really excited about that. Some of them aren't really, super sexy bills. They're not necessarily headline bills, but they are bills that are going to make a meaningful impact immediately for women and their families across Tennessee. And there was one other bill that those of you who receive our advocacy alerts made calls for, and thank you, that we added in the middle of the session, and that was to stop a bill that would have prohibited anonymous reporting of child abuse. The Children's Advocacy Center contacted the Women's Fund and said, oh, this bill is bad. What can we do to help stop it? And we worked with them. We made a number of calls. It had one of our largest click rates on one of our emails, in terms of people being interested. and we did stop that bill. Anonymous reporting of abuse is incredibly important, because oftentimes the people reporting are in regular contact with abusers and fear for themselves as well. And we do not want to take away any avenue that we have, to protect children or the abused or victims of any kind, in our state. So those are the wins. I went through them quickly, but the link is in the chat if you want to read more about them, or I am happy to answer questions about them. But the big message is thank you to all of you who made calls, who did work, and who helped us pass those. Questions? No? Okay, then let's look ahead, because I'm done with what we've done and I'm moving forward, and hopefully you'll be there with me. The first thing we know now is that we can do more. This session was great for us working with a really diverse group of legislators, many of whom we've never worked with before. Our relationships are stronger. For many people, they found the in-person restrictions at the beginning of session and through session to be difficult. I found them to really improve my relationships with a number of legislators. There are a lot of them that, as I learned this year, prefer phone calls and they prefer a quick meeting and they're happy to have you text them, rather than always being in person. And many of you know I love a good text or an email to communicate, or a 5-minute phone call instead of a 15-minute meeting. And our relationships are stronger. And these bills that we supported, we made sure we were touching a lot of different legislators and supporting a lot of different legislators, so that we are now in a position to make bigger asks and to have bigger conversations, with folks who already trust us and who already have a relationship with us. So I don't necessarily say we're going to do more in terms of number, but I do think we can contribute to some asks for some bigger changes. And that's where my focus is right now. Looking ahead, there are some new pieces of legislation that we are in our exploratory phase in. One that we're not really exploring and that we're ready to start looking for sponsors for is introducing the idea and the instruction of consent in the family life curriculum here in Tennessee. Those of you who are familiar with sex education in Tennessee know that it isn't sex education. It's the family life curriculum. It's abstinence only until marriage, with lots of restrictions about what we can talk about. And so unless something is explicitly added to that curriculum, it is not included. And consent, the notion of consent, a legal definition of consent, and the teaching of consent is not explicitly in that family life curriculum. And it's a place where I think we can make some change and get it added. Though sex education is back to its place as a very contentious issue nationwide. So it'll be a hard lift, but one that I think we're ready for. And we have some folks in a national coalition helping us draft some language so that we can look for some sponsors for that. And then the issues that we are currently exploring as possible places that we can introduce new legislation or find folks to run with new legislation include exclusionary discipline alternatives and policy. Exclusionary discipline in schools we're talking about suspension and expulsion. We're talking about things that remove students from the learning environment. And we know from local, as in statewide research and national research, that exclusionary discipline approaches are used more frequently with students of color than they are with white students. And we know factually in Tennessee from the surveys that have been done, in particular, that Black girls face greater exclusionary discipline measures than any other subgroup of female students. And we are not okay with that. So we've been digging into exclusionary discipline research for about 8 months, and hopefully this summer we'll be able to look at policies that have been implemented in other states with some bipartisan support to see if we can move on those. So our next step is really to see what policies have been implemented in other states. Another thing that we're exploring right now is financial institution training in economic abuse or interpersonal violence and economic abuse. So what processes do banks and financial institutions have in place to recognize victims and fraudulent debt issues and economic abuse issues, and how do they serve those clients? This is a conversation that I'm having with a lot of folks. I'm also having it in my house because my husband is a risk and compliance officer, and he has lots of feelings about regulations and increased trainings. But we're digging in. There are some sample policies out there, and it's just a matter of getting a feel for who will support this and how much of a difference it would make. In that same vein, we're looking into creating a designated tort so that survivors have the right to sue their harm doers for coerced or fraudulent debt. So if you are a victim of someone who forces you, coerces you, or steals from you, as it pertains to your finances, is there a road for you to take to regain your financial independence and good standing? And then back to what Katie had mentioned about the public employee wage bill for the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. We are currently working with some partners in the state to explore what other public employee wage improvements we might be able to take in specific areas, just like it was with the direct care providers for that piece of legislation. What other either contracted or public employee workers are there where we see really an opening to introduce and work on this? So we're also working on that. Are there any questions about those? They're really in exploratory stages right now, though I do think that we're going to be able to move forward with most of them.
Janine, on the exclusionary discipline stuff,
Yes.
Have you talked with anybody from Caleb about that?
I have not, because we're still so preliminary in a lot of the research. I stopped sharing so I could see your faces. We're still so preliminary in so much of the research. We have worked with some of the youth serving organizations in the state. So, and we've started working, with those folks that are, directly interacting with students, oftentimes many of the students who face these things. But I will do that. And in fact, I'll reach out to you if you want to recommend who maybe the best person would be for me to reach out to.
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, I think that they've got some people, the other organizations they collaborate across the state that are interested in that issue. So I think you could get some good support, at least in that work.
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge issue. Because, well, one, exclusionary discipline is really something that should only be used as an absolute last resort, because removing any student from the learning environment is exactly what we're trying not to do in education. So it's something that's really near and dear to my heart. It's also near and dear to Erica's heart. And we've spent a lot of time with some studies and really digging into them and trying to figure out, hey, what can we do with this? And it's really a 49-to-1 issue, because women aren't going to be doing better if certain populations of women are excluded from excelling in education, in my opinion.
And you also have the situation of kids being suspended and they have to be at home, and then they have to find childcare for a kid, or just leave their kid at home, which could be, so I've seen that happen.
Yeah, it's there are much better ways for us to take care of our students, to acknowledge ACEs as we're taking care of our students, and to consider alternatives to exclusion without better developed processes to reach that point. in my opinion. It's strong. Um, so I think we'll have the opportunity to dig in there. Other questions? Okay, yay, because I have a question. So that's so much better. And it's cheating because Monica and I have exchanged some emails, but it's what issues are on your minds? This is the time of year. If there is something that is eating at you, this is the time of year to get it on our plates. We can do the research. We can talk with our partners. We can see what organizations might be able to lead on that issue, or if it's a women's fund issue, or what we can do. Katie, I saw you. I'll go there and then jump in, folks.
This is pressing for me. I do have an unstable internet connection, so if I can't finish this, I'll just send you an email. Can we piggyback on the DIDD success for people who otherwise take care of the elderly or disabled who are not part of DIDD? Are there pay equity problems with other populations of caregivers who need caregivers?
Yeah, there are profound equity issues. The underpayment of our caregivers in elder care facilities and child care facilities is an issue of paramount importance. The trick with making that change and where we're stuck, Katie, is why the DIDD bill was able to pass is it was specifically dealing with folks who are contracted by the state of Tennessee. So the legislature could pass that bill and impact directly how the state is spending funds versus telling private businesses, which much of our elder care is done privately, that you have to pay this. So I think that is a big part of that makes it really difficult for us to figure out how we can approach that sort of pay equity and pay increase as we need it. But yes, it is a huge problem. It's one that we're aware of. It's just super complicated figuring out how do we dig in and get to it because Tennessee is not a state that is going to implement mandates to private businesses, particularly small private businesses.
Right. Some of the money goes through TennCare through the Choices program. I don't know if that's an avenue to pursue.
I don't either, but I'm writing it down and I'll find out.
Right. glad to help if I can.
Yeah, no, thank you. But it is, and elder care is another place where we're really talking about women who are predominantly in those roles. And this is the kind of position that we need to help support.
I have a interesting fact when it comes to elder care too and women. The number one reason why women get put in nursing homes is because of incontinence. And incontinence is largely preventable with pelvic health training at any stage in someone's life. It could be right after someone had a baby or years later, it still makes a difference. And so I think it'd be fascinating to help women get more support and prevent women from, getting put in nursing homes on a largely preventable issue.
That's something that we could probably do something about. It would take us a few years because there's a lot of education to be done, but but I think that you just made an economic argument for pelvic health training being not only included but provided. Right, which it's horrible for me to say that. We should do it anyway, but I need an economic measure to make it a bill that I can feasibly move with. So thank you, Monica. I did not know that, but it's fascinating. I mean, in a nerdy policy way.
I have a friend that works in pelvic health, particularly for expecting or recovering mothers. And she's talked about the process of trying to deal with insurance and everything like that. And she's gone more to an educational position because it's so hard for her in her personal practice to maintain working with insurances versus not taking insurance and everything. So it's hard for her to reach a lot of people.
Can you connect me with her so I can hear about her insurance woes?
Oh yeah, she would love to tell you about them.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I would love to hear about some insurance woes. Other,
I could talk about that too. I also
oh,
switched over
sweet.
from a big box pelvic health like thing into more private practice and education because insurance does take away a lot. So I'm happy to share that in a different conversation.
I just wrote it down, so we can talk about that.
Okay.
Are there other issues? And the reason I'm begging is if I don't dig in and we don't get the information on them, it delays how long it will take us to work on them.
I don't
Okay.
mean to like keep asking questions. I do have one other one. Do you know what the training is required for judges when it comes to interpartner violence and just being trained on like narcissism and coercion and, you know, economic and financial abuse and not just like physical abuse, and what their training is or requirements are for that to become a judge?
I don't know, but we have a board member who is a judge. So I'm happy to pose that question to her. And then I can have,
Yeah.
I can get a response from her, you know, and Rachel and I can make sure it gets distributed out to folks. But that's a great question. And I'm not sure. And I'm sure that Christy would be able to tell us.
Yeah, I was just kind of envisioning like some of the training that might have happened or is planning on happening with the cosmetologists and hairdressers, like even something, some kind of yearly refresher or something like that for judges and people who might have seen cases but not be up to date on the current research and stats and things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And
Janine, I wonder if we could, I know that Christie's like availability is a challenge. So I wonder if we could even connect with her and see like when might work and we could potentially schedule a time to like just sit down and like ask her some of those questions if you feel like that'd be worthwhile.
yeah, I mean, I think the first question is just, are they getting it? And I can text her that. And you know, it may not be that we have a lot of follow-up questions depending on how much they are or not receiving. I know that Mike Carter had told me in the past that it always surprised him how much he was expected to know. Right? Like once he had a seat on the bench, he was always surprised at how much he was supposed to know. And he felt like he was always trying to research and understand issues. While he was on the bench, which leads me to wonder just how much training was he getting if he shared with me that there was that much work to be done and that much knowledge to be gained. So I'm just not sure. Other thoughts, comments?
I do have
I'd love to
another
see
one.
like breastfeeding support, like more support for breastfeeding for working moms.
And that is something that A Better Balance is working on.
Cool.
I can tell you that. And Katie, what were you going to add?
Yeah, this is related to economic abuse of vulnerable populations as well as equitable pay. There is a 10-care rule where you cannot pay a family caregiver, an aunt, an uncle, a daughter. You cannot pay them to take care of an elderly person who's being kept out of a nursing home because of home care. That's, to me, it's always seemed to me to be unfair. If that's a CMS rule, I know we can't do anything about it. But if it's a 10-care rule, it needs to be looked at. If we compensated family members for the elder care they're providing, it saves us money from those people renting in nursing homes, and also save some of the elderly and disabled people from abuse, the financial abuse they might suffer from when they receive care from a family member.
Yeah, I am not sure where that bill or that mandate originates, but that's easy to find out. But I can tell you that probably one of the strongest proponents we have for eliminating elder care abuse and for improving elder care options. Mind you, we have to have an economic argument and economic understanding of the situation, but one of the strongest proponents we have is Senator Gardenhire. He has led a number of bills on behalf of elder care and the elderly. And so this is something that it is relatively easy for us to explore because it is an issue that one of his issues that he's really passionate about. So that's certainly something we can explore with him coming up. These are good ideas. And like I said, this is the tinder that gets us started as we're looking for new bills. And certainly we are continuing to work on a number of the issues that we have always worked on and that we are still working on. The advocate confidentiality bill that we've been working on for 2 years will be back again in 2022. And we are bound and committed to working with Awake to make sure that bill passes. Other things that we are working on and that we will continue to work on are paid leave. I think we have ourselves in a strategic position to have more meaningful conversations about paid leave next year. And one of the paid leave bills was sent to summer study. Normally, summer study is like a slow place to die for a bill, for lack of a better way to say it. But if a summer study is utilized well, it's also a chance to really inform the legislature. And so there are a lot of folks across the state, myself included, that have been on calls saying, what information do we need to make sure this summer study is highlighting and underscoring and emphasizing about paid leave and about the economic impacts of paid leave to our legislators so that we have a chance to start moving some of those bills through committees. As it stands now, paid leave is a little bit like equal pay. We have never gotten an equal pay bill or a paid leave bill through a subcommittee or a committee. If we play the summer study right, maybe we can make it through the first subcommittee or the second or through a committee, because everyone in our legislature is more willing to have the conversation about leave after this past year than they ever were before. But we need to capitalize on that and really get this conversation moving this summer. As to equal pay, Monica emailed me, I don't know, was that last week? It might've been this week, about, how do we move on equal pay in Tennessee? It's something we always prioritize. It's something that we're going to have to get more targeted about. There are other partners who have typically led this. We're looking for some avenues where maybe we can have multiple organizations leading things. The most, like, the groundwork that needs to be done to move on equal pay, because we are not in a state that's going to mandate sharing of salaries and pay or of, equity reports from organizations. So here are things that we can do. Salary history questions need to be eliminated. If women and minorities are historically paid less, if you base their salary when they're coming into a job based on their salary history, they will continue to make less. Salary ranges and pay rates for positions need to be published when the job is opened, right? So when a job position is posted, it needs to say the salary range is this to this for the incoming person. And those people applying for that job need to be given a fair baseline from which to start their negotiations. Because if I, as a woman, have always made 40% less than a man with the same experience and with the same number of degrees as me, right? Because the more degrees you get, the wider the disparity in what you're paid. If I go in asking for a 20% raise, I'm still asking for less starting than a man applying. And maybe that will get me a job, but it won't get me equal pay. Right? And that's the problem. So we need to get rid of salary histories. We need to start publishing salary or pay rates and ranges when jobs are opened. And that needs to be mandated. Those are the two most obvious open doors to start fixing it. Because again, I don't see mandates coming. We have never rephrase. In the last 6 years, we have not had a bill introduced about mandating sharing the salary range for positions. I think that can be done. I think it needs to be done. We need to start by saying the state needs to make it more transparent instead of just saying it's this group of salaries. Like, they need to make it clear on their website. We need to make it clear. But equal pay and paid leave, I mean, they're resonating issues right now with folks on both sides of the aisle, and those are things we can do. Monica, I wish there was a better answer. Equal pay is a long, hard fight. I do think those are the ways to start it, though. And we'll keep working on mental health bills. That's a personal passion of mine. Once I saw that Tennessee was among the worst states for women committing suicide and women's mental health, and these are the continuing priority issues that we have going on. And the last thing I wanted to mention and bring up to you all is that in addition to looking ahead for what we can do that's positive, we're also committing a lot of energy to how to respond to some really awful things that happened in our legislature this past session. There were a lot of bills that I could say were really awful. As it relates to the work of the Women's Fund, there were a number of really terrible reproductive rights bills. We are fortunate to be in a position where we have a lot of partners across the state who work on a lot of those. But one of the ones that falls directly into our lane and the work and the progress that we've led on is a bill that forbids really instruction about contraception in schools, even if the questions are raised by the students. Contraception access is always an issue. We can't distribute it in our schools. Can't talk about having sex, so it's hard to talk about contraception. We can't talk about gateways to sex, so it's hard to talk about contraception. We can talk about STIs, just not exactly how they get them, but it leaves a door to talk about contraception. And we know that the less students know about how to protect themselves, the less equipped they are to protect themselves. And conversations about contraception stop it, need to be allowed in schools. And this bill is one, we don't know exactly what the impact will be. We have folks statewide reaching out to educators who teach these programs. But that bill is one that is really hitting hard on an issue that we've been trying to move forward on since before I was at the Women's Fund. And the other one is the bill that was passed in the final hour. Wilder! In the final hour, little Wilder's here, y'all, that forbids the teaching of critical race theory in schools. I'm sure you all heard about this bill. What you may not have heard, because it wasn't quite as public, is that not only can you not teach critical race theory, but you also can't teach what would basically be the same thing about critical gender theory. So we can no longer say that white men have been in privileged economic positions as compared to women because they were white men. We can no longer teach our students that even though women gained the right to vote, there were still all of these multiple hurdles for women to jump to actually be able to vote. You earned the right to vote, and then it was over, right? If you can't teach this critical theory, then it was done. Slavery ended, it was over, hooray. Jim Crow ended, it was over, hooray. And they're taking away critical race theory, and the same when it pertains to gender, eliminates the opportunity to teach our students to think critically about anything that's happening socially or culturally around them. It also limits our effectiveness as a Women's Fund to promote equity for women and for students and for mothers and for caregivers and for families. We're trying to figure out what there is we can do. The problem with legislation being passed in Tennessee is that it's unlikely that we can change the legislation without massive support, this is going to be something where nonprofits who work in youth serving facilities are going to have to introduce these elements into their programming until we can fix it in our schools. But know that we are working on it. There's a statewide coalition. There are national groups trying to figure out how to respond to these bills, because it wasn't just in Tennessee. There have been other districts in other states also passing it. But a lot of our energy right now is being split on how do we minimize the impact of these negative things, and how do we maximize our impact in achieving positive things. But I probably shouldn't have ended on that, because it's really kind of a downer. I should have done it the other way around, but if you're on this call, the work is never over. So we'll continue working on these things, but that's where we are at in our work. Those are the issues I'm looking at. I'll look into the other issues that you all lifted up for us. And that's where we're at moving forward. I'll be working with Rachel to figure out how we can share some of this load with the advocacy committee. And if you're not on the advocacy committee and connected with Rachel, you should connect with Rachel, because there might be an opportunity for you to help out. Sorry, Rachel, I totally just did that. And of course, my email, my phone, they're always available. But I am here to answer any questions. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up maybe early and give you a couple minutes of your day back, which I never do.
Janine, would you like me to post the other 2 links?
Oh, thank you, Katie. I did
Okay.
send Katie two additional links to share in the chat. One is to a program that the YWCA is sponsoring tomorrow on the importance of teaching critical race theory to our students. Like we should have. Anyway, it will be extremely well done. Their programs always are. And their registration is still open, and Katie dropped that into the chat. So if you're interested in that, I think it'll be just phenomenal. I'm going to miss it. So if you're able to go, I'd also love to hear about it. But Hannah has promised that she'll send me the recording. So if you can't go and you're interested, email me at the end of the week and I'll send that to you. And then the other link that Katie's going to share is a report. Monica also saw this. It's from an organization called Freeform. They work with us at the Women's Funding Network, which is the National Coalition of Women's Funds, to help us figure out what advocacy steps we can take. And this report in particular was dealing with the economic factors of abuse and what policies are and are not in place in various states. There are not many in Tennessee, but it's a really cool overview. It's a single web page. You can look at it, learn a lot, email questions if you have them, or if you read something and you're like, this is wildly important, tell me it's particularly resonating with you. We have forwarded a condensed version of these issues to our partners at the Family Justice Center and at Partnership, and some other organizations who work directly with victims, so that they can tell us what their priority issues are on this page, so that we are lifting up and supporting our partners if we choose to work on them. But I'd also love to hear from you if you have thoughts. And Katie had that link as well. Thank you, Katie. I totally forgot. Questions? That's so much information. I love y'all being here and listening to it.
Thank you for the resources, and thanks for the invitation to give feedback about priorities and things. I feel like my brain will still be spinning for a while, so follow-up emails.
You know where to find me. And please, like I said, now is the time. Usually takes 3 to 4 months to get the research done and to find the language to even begin talking about the possibility of a bill with legislators. And it usually takes at least a full year before I have legislators ready to buy on as sponsors. So I think it's really important, if you have ideas, if you have priorities, get them to us. If we can't move on them now, I will put them in the hands of our fall interns to get me viable research. So it's the first thing I work on next session. but it is important, and time is of the essence. When people give me an idea in January when session starts, I can't. There's no possible way. Oh, Wilder, you and Dempsey. In that case, thank you, friends and new friends and attendees. And please reach out if you have questions, thoughts, comments, concerns, any of the things.
Thank you.
Thanks, Janine, for all your hard
Thank
work.
you. Thank you.
Y'all.